Hey, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where we welcome converts, but where we think like disciples. This is a show where we do our best to apply theologic to all of life. For example, guns. The day after... I think you must mean the year after? No, the day after the Supreme Court had ruled against the state of New York, the United States Congress, undoubtedly to the pleasure of one Mr. Matthew McConaughey, yes, all right, the United States Congress passed still more strict gun legislation. New York State had a century-old law on their books requiring that one had to apply for state permission. Basically, you had to prove to the state that you had a special need for self-defense. And the tragedy to my now not urban mind of needing special permission to defend oneself in an increasingly violent city like New York is ironic to say the least. I mean, there are reasons for stereotypes, right? Getting mugged in New York City is a stereotype for a reason.
I heard that.
Anyway, thank goodness. No, thank reason. SCOTUS, in a 6-3 ruling, ruled that the New York state law violated the 14th Amendment, and that 14th Amendment was a law passed clear back in 1868, which guarantees all Americans the right to equal protection under the law, and which forbids states from denying citizens life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, does this new ruling mean that SCOTUS wants us all living in a wild, wild west where we all carry machine guns over our shoulders? Hardly. Stop. The New York Post reports out the following from Supreme Court Justices Roberts and Kavanaugh, quote, properly interpreted, the Second Amendment allows a variety of gun regulations. Again, that was Roberts and Kavanaugh, who also noted that states can still make applicants for a firearm license undergo fingerprinting, a background check, a mental health records check, and trainings in firearms handling in laws regarding the use of force, among other possible requirements, end quote. But the notion that one has to get special state permission to protect oneself is patently absurd. And I'm glad that SCOTUS affirmed that. Theirs is a ruling not only for personal liberty, but for something that America's founders fiercely promoted, freedom from the overbearing nanny state. And then, of course, on Friday, June 24th, it probably needs to be turned into some kind of federal holiday, we had the SCOTUS ruling that finally after the leak, some 54 days prior, and finally in terms of just a teeny bit reasonable moral framework, overturned the disastrous 1973 pro-abortion ruling. Amazing. Thank you to the most pro-life president in the last 50 years, Donald Trump. Thank you, Mitch McConnell, for having some courage to block the Merrick Garland nomination. Praise God. Praise you, Holy Spirit, you who weigh upon men's consciences. Praise you, breath of God, who bring truth to hearts and minds. Praise you have heard the cries of your church now over these 5 decades. Praise you, Lord, Fons Vitae, fountain of life. I never thought I'd live to see the day when that unholy abortion law was overturned. But guys, I need to make some important clarifications regarding this historic SCOTUS ruling. Today, one side is tearfully happy and the other side is red-hot angry that not so many babies will be killed. Proverbs 21:15 says, when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers. The 1973 Roe abortion Supreme Court ruling was itself not based in either history or law. There just was nothing in the Constitution about abortion. And there had never been a prior law on the federal books permitting abortion. So the notion that the Constitution itself guaranteed the right to an abortion was specious at best and totally fabricated at worst. Well, I'm going to let you decide, specious or fabricated. Legal scholars have, for 49 years now, called that 1973 SCOTUS ruling one of the worst in American history, a ruling that is rivaled only by Dred Scott back in 1857, which prohibited blacks from becoming American citizens, and that Roe v. Wade ruling was as worse well, it wasn't, I'll leave it up to you, as the worst opinion in Supreme Court history. Back in 1973, or actually back in 1965, then Justice William Douglas had written in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut that the sale and use of contraceptives was grounded in the penumbras formed by emanations in the Bill of Rights. Penumbras? Yeah, shadows, or areas wherein something exists to an uncertain degree. And emanations in the law? Wait, what does emanations mean? It means whatever the majority opinion judges wanted it to mean. And then a few years later, 8 years later or so, the Supreme Court took that notion of penumbras and emanations and ensconced it in the logic of the SCOTUS pro-abortion ruling. So, man, if that all isn't grasping at straws, I don't know what is. The Supreme Court was then essentially admitting, look, we have no precedent here, but liberty. They were saying, yeah, we admit it, this is not in the founding documents, but freedom, abortion? Yes, please, now the law of the land. It was just a disaster of a ruling. And today's conservative justices corrected that in a 6-3 vote. They corrected that 60-year-old mess. Because the historical and legal truth is, you guys, there never was, contrary to every progressive and every major media news reporter's vehement words, there never was a constitutional right to an abortion. There was a Supreme Court affirmation of abortion in 1973, yeah. But the Supreme Court is not the Constitution. And so today, 49 years later, between 55 million and 70 million babies aborted, today, 49 years later, society shredded by arguments over abortion, every federal election poisoned by arguments and concern with federal approval of abortion. So, what now? What's next? States will be able to determine for their own state how to proceed with abortion. The Supreme Court ruling didn't ban abortion. It handed it back to the states. And some states, about 20 of them, are already doing their best to all but outlaw abortion. And some, about 20 or so, will do everything in their power to make abortion available and funded and protected as a kind of unholy sacrament. And then there's about 10 states, purple states, that are somewhere in the middle of the matter. But it'll be up to the states to decide, and that's good. Why? Because that means abortion will be decided at local levels rather than inside the cloistered halls of buildings in Washington, D.C. People inside their states. People will get to argue and vote over when a life begins, or when a fetus deserves, or not, the full protection of the law. People, not a few black-robed judges, people will decide what penalties, if any, there should be for clinics and doctors and nurses who perform abortions outside or beyond the scope of that local state's laws. People, not federal politicians who ever cater to their big donors, people will help to determine what public money should be spent on abortions. And you guys, this is going to take years for the effects of all this to shake out. Oh, and then this one. All the noise about companies saying they will pay for their employees to travel to pro-abortion states for abortions, they are just virtue signaling. Really? The other day, my wife, herself having worked in human resources for 38 years, she made the observation that there will be very few women who actually apply for a company-paid for abortion travel stipend. Do they really want the HR office knowing they got an abortion? Do they really want their coworkers knowing they just had an abortion? The actual number of these is going to be small. It's mostly just POMO virtue signaling. And then, what about Planned Parenthood? Will they continue to get governmental monies? Yes, but we'll see what individual states do to begin paring that back. And I just don't know how federal monies are tied through Planned Parenthood to other or possibly related policies. And if you do know that, my listener, please email me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com. But on the other side of the issue, more homes and organizations and facilities, both public and private, will spring up to help mothers care for their babies. And it's likely that we will see more pregnancies go full term. Probably, my bet, adoption will become more prevalent in American society than ever before. I read a tweet. Man, is Twitter a sewer or what? I read a tweet angrily saying, "What a shame that we will now have more children going on to welfare, more children being abused than ever before." And I say, "Yep, that's right, because their lives weren't taken in utero." Probably, my bet, more Christian ministries will arise to help care for mothers and babies, and all of that's a glorious thing. And please, Lord, use the presence of more babies to wake our nation's collective conscience. Use a life-affirming culture to build still deeper and better and truer and loving relationships. Probably, I'm betting, there will be 0 more women now forced by their husbands or families or churches or businesses to wear a red Handmaid's Tale dress and head covering. Thank you for that one, Babylon Bee. No, the left is red-hot angry because now the Supreme Court is no longer a cherished vehicle for enacting legislation that they couldn't get through the Congress. The Supreme Court's job is to rule whether legislation is constitutional or not, as the founders had established it. But no longer, or at least for now, no longer is the Supreme Court the second wing of the Democratic Congress. And like I said, that just has the left out of their minds, steaming hot. And then, what about legislating morality? After all, as everyone listening undoubtedly heard in a college class, one cannot legislate morality, so Roe v. Wade may have been overturned, but you just can't legislate morality. If women want to get an abortion, they'll find a way. Oh yeah, I don't doubt women will find ways to get abortions, but I disagree. You actually can legislate morality. And despite what every sloppy ethics professor says to the contrary, that's a significant reason civilizations have laws to begin with, to legislate morality. You don't believe me? Go to Singapore. Just look around and see if you can find a wad of gum anywhere on the sidewalks. Or go to Switzerland. Look at how little graffiti there is on their city walls. Sheesh. I was just in Southern California for a few days. I can't believe it's so filthy. Trash strewn all over the freeways and city gutters and alleyways. So sad to such a beautiful state. But yeah, morality actually can be legislated, is daily legislated around the globe. And the states that make abortion illegal or less legal, less frequent, it's my bet that they'll also begin funding educational programs to help teach children about why abortion on demand is such a vile element in society. As I speak, there are 28 states with Republican governors. And I'll promise you this. In those 28 states, more public school teachers will remark in their classes about the truths of abortion than had ever happened across the last 49 years. And churches, God help them, churches, communities ostensibly gathered to proclaim a holy biblical worldview, churches may even begin speaking up with a little courage about the sin of society-wide abortion on demand, and all of that's good by me. But because abortion is far more about hearts and minds than it is about laws, we need to shape hearts and minds. Hearts and minds are collectively much more central to moral matters than our laws. Welcome, you guys, to my second episode about climate change. Last week I talked about scientific method and how and why and that science is ever committed to accurately seeing reality, and why science just cannot, by her own long-adopted rules, cannot function based on consensus. And when it comes to scientific study of the climate, we're talking about tremendously complicated dynamics. Today's climate change cadre, they rely primarily upon computer models for their predictions. But there's just too much at stake, too much at issue, too much that is idiopathic, accidental, too many variables for any serious reliance upon computer models. And to boot, those computer models too often reach a predestined outcome, one desired by the computer model designer. Scientist Ian Plimmer said, "We can't make nature conform to virtual computer models. Nature is fickle." No, the matter is far more complex than we are being told by politicians or the mainstream media. Gersh. Just thinking extemporaneously with you, my listener, we here in Spudlandia just enjoyed what the local farmers are calling a 1 in 30 year springtime. 2 months ago, my local HOA president was sorrowfully telling us that we would run out of off-the-mountain irrigation water for our lawns by the end of July or so. But now, after a record, a 1 in 30 year amount of rainfall in May and early June, not only have the Idaho farmers happily planted their second crop rotation, we just got told we have enough irrigation water to water our lawns through the end of September. What? Nature is fickle. There is far more to consider than computer modeling. Climate is profoundly complex. Himself a professor in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Adelaide in South Australia, Ian Plimmer says, quote, "An understanding of climate requires an amalgamation of astronomy, and just one factor in the middle of that is the eccentricity of Earth's elliptical orbit. We need astronomy, solar physics, geology, geochronology, geochemistry, sedimentology, tectonics, paleontology, paleoecology, glaciology, climatology, meteorology, oceanography, ecology, archaeology, and history," end quote. And he didn't even give a nod to theology and all of that. But the notion that merely rehearsing the average global temperatures over a decade to arrive at some future prediction is silly at best and naive at worst. Today, we've heard a huge shift in vocabulary among those who embrace climate change as an existential threat to human existence. I used to teach my students that anytime you can mix the word existential into your remarks, you'll sound wise. People esteem you more highly. And don't think for a minute that the climate alarmists don't think the same thing, right? We're not merely threatened by the climate, we're faced with an existential threat. Oh, it's so good. Remember way back to the year 2000 or so when the scary mantra was about global warming? Well, that wasn't the first time that the alarmists were preying upon our imaginations and fears. This fear porning has been around for at least 50 years. Gosh, it's so sad to realize that, as Hoover Institute visiting fellow Bjorn Lomborg reports, quote, half the world's surveyed population believes human extinction is likely and that faced with possible annihilation, any expenditure is justified, end quote. I do remember watching the Johnny Carson Tonight Show back while I was a kid in the 1960s. Here's Johnny. I don't remember it, but Johnny regularly had Stanford ecologist Paul Ehrlich on his show. And Ehrlich would go on TV and prophesy that the planet was on the brink of destruction. And on that point, recounts scientist Lomborg, Paul Ehrlich on CBS National News in 1970 explained that the world would end before 1985. He said on camera, sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity. End quote. And Ehrlich added that between 1 and 2 billion people would die from starvation due to this climate change, and that the average American lifespan would only be 42 years long. Well, echoing that kind of fear-porning, Life magazine reported in 1970 that horrors lie in wait, and that within 10 years, urban dwellers will have to wear gas masks to survive air pollution, end quote. Well, my listener, I hardly need to point out that 1 to 2 billion have not died from climate change or air pollution, and frankly, one can argue the human race has never had it better than today. Get this. By the year 1980, the average American lifespan had reached 74 years. Sorry, Mr. Ehrlich, that's not 42, that's 74. And today, the average lifespan is up to 79 years in the United States. In fact, as Plimmer notes in his book Heaven and Earth, Global Warming and the Missing Science, quote, we humans on Earth have never had it better. Compared with 100 or 200 or 500 years ago, we Westerners live longer, have a better diet, are wealthier, are healthier, and the elderly have far better health care than ever. Even in the third world, times are far better than before. Life expectancy has improved. In China, life expectancy has increased from 41 years in the 1950s to 71 today. In India, life expectancy has increased from 39 years to 63 today. And in both of those countries, the lifespan of 2 billion people has been almost doubled, end quote. So again, sorry, Mr. Ehrlich, Mr. Paul Ehrlich, your doomsday predictions failed to come true by, how you say, a lot? We'll get back to the history of climate change alarmism. Do you support some Christian missional ministry? I sure hope so. I hope you support your local church and their multi-form efforts to bring Christ to bear on the world. But if you're not financially supporting a ministry, why not support the UU? You can go to Patreon, Patreon, and make a $5 or up to $25 or more than that if you want monthly pledge. It's easy. Once you register, it automatically processes your monthly pledge. And not only do I send my Patreon supporters the transcripts for my shows, I also interact with them on a private Facebook page. So please prayerfully consider supporting a show for thinking. My sincere thanks. Oh man, climate change alarmism. Remember, way back to the year 2000 or so when the oft-repeated and scary mantra was about global warming? Yeah, me too. Well, they changed their tune. As you know, my listener, it's no longer about global warming, but climate change. Why? Well, scientists began to realize that the Earth's average temperatures began to flatten in 1998. Geologist Gregory Wrightstone notes, quote, according to Hadcrut 4 dataset, that's a temperature dataset that spanned 1961 to 1990. It's an amalgamation of datasets. According to the Hadcrut 4 dataset and backed up by satellite and balloon data, the global warming that began in 1976 suddenly and inexplicably stopped. According to global warming theory, humankind's ongoing contribution of carbon dioxide should have continued to warm the planet's atmosphere. Yet for almost 18 years, from 1998 to 2016, at the publication date of Dr. Wrightstone's book, the warming stopped as carbon dioxide relentlessly increased, end quote. So, just which is it that's going to end our lives inside of 9 years? Thank you for that one, Congresswoman AOC. She said that, quote, climate change would destroy the planet by the year 2031 if people failed to address a generational challenge she likened to World War II. She said millennials and people, Gen Z and all these folks that will come after us are looking up and we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. Which is it that's going to end life inside of 9 years, global warming or climate change? Well, the answer is whichever one makes you stop driving your SUV to your kid's soccer practice. Which is it, global warming or climate change? Whichever one gets you to hand over the levers of your personal liberty to the state. Goodness, AOC, so covetous of power, she is now calling for the impeachment of the conservative Supreme Court justices. After all, she didn't get her way, so in her mind, it's time for another power play. It's so transparent. But along the way, something unanticipated shot through the recent climate alarmists' doomsday predictions. What was it? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. First, some gratitude. And I am happy to express my gratitude. Annette B., Charlotte B., Victor S., Joanna J., Scott M., Lauren R., and Josh E., thank you truly for your social media love. Your social media accounts have a reach that I don't. So every time you share a UU post or a URL feed, you're helping me promote the show. And for that, danke, mein homies. What shot through the climate alarmists' doomsday predictions? Well, the gradual warming we'd been tracking for nearly 2 decades stopped. It flatlined. I know that's cray-cray, right? I mean, goodness, when I was in high school back in the 1930s, oh, I always knew you were older than you let on. Oh, you got me. Yep, today I am 111. But when I was in high school, we were being warned, well, by only a few teachers, about an impending ice age. Why? Because scientists know that the climate's average annual temperatures fluctuate, and the trend 50 years ago was cooling, not warming. And I wondered, is my memory about that correct? Yep. Get this. Again, science professor Plimer reports that, quote, on June 24, 1974, Time magazine warned that we would suffer from a new ice age, as did Newsweek in April of 1975 and National Geographic in 1976. But that's not all. In April of 2006, Time was at it again. Plimer writes, quote, the issue had a special report on global warming. And the effects of the predicted global cooling on humans back in 1974 were exactly the same as the effects of global warming on humans in 2006. And Plimer adds, we only need to substitute the word warming for cooling, and we have the identical alarmism 30 years later. Meanwhile, he continues, meanwhile, the climate stubbornly refuses to cooperate with computer models and the writers of alarmist popular articles and books. End quote. So today's uptake, you guys, the Earth's climate fluctuates. It changes. It changes in short spans. It changes across eons of time. Sometimes there are short bursts of warming, other times short bursts of cooling. But we cannot push for substantial, nationwide, change the course of your lifestyle kind of sweeping policies based on short climate spans. And yet, that is precisely what the climate alarmists and their allies in the media are doing. It's not only bad propaganda, it's bad science. Science is willing to look in the mirror. Science is willing to adapt and change and recalibrate when the data changes. And just as important, science is willing to pause and wait and watch and observe when there's not yet enough data. Professor Wrightstone cautions us, quote, recorded history is a blink of an eye in geological time, end quote. We've only had thermometer data from the last 250 years. We've only been gathering satellite-driven data for 50 years. And yet, the climate alarmists want us to believe their computer models, based on very recent developments, are piercingly accurate? Come on, man. Back in 1814, the Thames River, not Thames, not Thames, but Thames. Class, please say Thames. Thames, teacher. The Thames River flowing through London froze solid in 1814. That cold year was at the end of what climatologists now know was a mini ice age that had lasted from 1250 to 1850. During those miserable 600 years, the population of Northern Europe suffered dearly. Who was this? Wrightstone. Professor Wrightstone says that during those miserable 600 years, the population of Northern Europe suffered dearly. They endured famine, poor harvests, disease, and widespread loss of life, end quote. And that little ice age brought some of the coldest temperatures in the last 4,500 years. What? What in the name of planet Earth is going on? Well, the climate fluctuates on a regular, irregular basis. Hey, I have so much hard science to unpack for you in this series that's relevant to the topic of climate change. For now, thanks for joining me. And until next time, please, everyone, go and turn your beautiful God-given brains on.